Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. That's better. This is a communication school. We like to communicate like that. I do want to say welcome to the Annenberg School, or more appropriately, welcome back, since we're starting a new semester. And we're especially pleased to start this new semester with the outstanding campus-wide Arts and Humanities initiative that was started by Max Nikias when he was provost and continues under his authority as president of the university, called Visions and Voices. And this was established in 2005 by the then provost. And it really was designed to set out to inspire and provoke and affirm the human spirit. And it continues today in that same spirit, to inspire and provoke and to provide opportunities for artists and intellectuals and writers and others to come. And then we have a moment of reflection, or an opportunity of reflection, after they do their formal presentation. I would say that if you haven't done so already, please help yourself to a brochure, which is not digital entirely, but you can also check online for the complete list of Vision and Voices lectures, discussions, and performances from now through the end of April. So I really do encourage you to attend as many of these as you possibly can. In fact, you are all invited back to this very auditorium on the 6th of October to hear the poet, essayist, and playwright Professor Elizabeth Alexander. Some of you may remember that she read a poem at President Obama's inauguration, so she'll be here joining us for that event. Now on to tonight. This event has been actually sold out for weeks. In fact, we have set up not one overflow venue, but 2 overflow venues in order to fully accommodate the number of people who wanted to come to this great event. And this outpouring of interest is as unsurprising, in a sense, as it is well-deserved. We have wanted to bring Ken Auletta, whose work speaks so much of what we teach and research here at the school, to visit the Annenberg School for several years, and we're absolutely thrilled that we could make that happen this year and that Ken is with us this evening. Perhaps some of you noticed on the posters for tonight's event that Ken has been called by BusinessWeek, and I quote, "the James Bond of the media world." It's a pretty cool title. I mean, Ken shaking his head. It's a pretty cool title. And so it's hard to top that one, but let me try. Ken Auletta is the country's preeminent media writer, without a doubt. As an author and a journalist, Ken is the ideal combination of a deeply sourced and thorough reporter and a compelling storyteller and stylist. But as you've read throughout the years, and as you'll certainly hear this evening, Ken is more than just a chronicler of these events, of whether it's Rupert Murdoch or Ted Turner or Sergey Brin or the other great books that he's written, including the one we'll talk about tonight, Google. He's also a savvy analyst of what takes place inside these organizations. And he has a deep understanding of the products and people who so powerfully influence the digital age. Here at USC, our students and faculty are working feverishly and passionately to both be the next Ken Auletta, as well as to be the subjects of his next book, or a New Yorker piece. So we're hoping that some of our students will someday feature prominently in Ken's writing when they go on and do fabulous things that we know they will. And this extends from our Media Economics and Entrepreneurship Initiative, which we started here at the Annenberg School, to our Annenberg Innovation Laboratory, our News Incubator Program, to our suite of hyperlocal community news and multimedia publishing organizations, and to so many other cutting-edge things that we're doing in transmedia, multimedia, gaming, diversity studies, on the entertainment industry, and other kinds of engagements. Well, let's just say at the very minimum that USC Annenberg itself requires a fast and accurate search engine to keep up with everything that happens here. Fortunately, to help us keep up with what goes on with the world's most famous search engine, and one of the more remarkable enterprises of this or perhaps any other age, we have Ken Auletta. Ken is the author of 11 books, including the best-selling Googled: The End of the World as We Know It. Tonight, as you all know, Ken will be discussing the related topic, one near and dear to our hearts here in this building, which is Googled: The Future of Media. So to quote from the button on the Google homepage, I'm feeling lucky. And we all should, because we're now going to be able to welcome to the podium Ken Auletta. Let's welcome Ken to the podium.
Well, actually, I'm feeling lucky to be here. Thank you. And thanks, Ernie. How many of you know we're missing the Republican debate tonight? Raise your hand. Oh, many more of you are aware of that. You want the night off? For too long, traditional media companies were as clueless as the former NFL running back who said, I want to rush for 1,000 or 1,500 yards this year, whichever comes first. Bill Gates, when I interviewed him in 1998, was not clueless. We were sitting in his office outside of Seattle, and I asked him, I said, Mr. Gates, I said, what's your business nightmare? What do you most worry about? And I thought he would start naming some of his competitors. I worry about Netscape, I worry about Oracle, I worry about Sun Microsystems, I worry about Apple. That's not what he said. Just the two of us in his office, and he was seated, and he turned around to a little refrigerator he had behind him, and he pulled out a Diet Coke. And sorry for the stereotype, but like many engineers, he didn't think to offer me one. I was really thirsty. And he rocked gently back and forth in his chair, and he said, I'll tell you what I worry about. I worry about some guy in a garage inventing something I've never thought about. That's what I worry about. Well, in 1998, in a garage in Menlo Park, California, two guys, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, were inventing Google. And Google has, in fact, become Microsoft's worst nightmare. A company that has disrupted their main business. Increasingly, you can get apps in the cloud, Google Cloud, for free. That Microsoft charges you packaged software $300, $400, $500 for. Microsoft tried to get into the search business with Bing. It has a market share of about 12%. Google has a market share of 65% in this country. But if you think about Microsoft has Internet Explorer. And if you think about what the browser did for us, the browser made information available. What Google Search did to take it the next step was it made information accessible. So if I, as a writer, have at my fingertips a library through Google that I can look and search and find most any piece of information I wish to have, that is an incredible advance, not just for me as a writer, for you as students, faculty, citizens. And if you think about what that's done, if you go to many third world countries, today they can't afford textbooks, but they can afford cell phones. And what those cell phones do is use Google Search as their textbooks. It's quite extraordinary. So you think about what the impact of Google has been, it's quite extraordinary, but you think about the impact that it's also had on traditional media. It's been phenomenal, the impact that it has had on traditional companies, be they in the telephone business, the newspaper business, the television business, the advertising business, the software business. I asked Eric Schmidt, who was then the CEO of Google 2 years ago, I said, what's your ambition, Mr. Schmidt, for Google? And he said to me, I hope that Google will become the first $100 billion media company. He didn't say digital company. He didn't say technology company. He said media company. To give you an idea of how big $100 billion is, Disney, which is the largest media company in the world, does revenue of $50 billion, half that today. So the ambitions of Google are quite large and in fact quite disruptive to many businesses, particularly traditional media businesses. I like to think of what I do as a person who visits other planets. And what I want to do is visit a planet like Google and understand the natives, how they function, what their culture is, what their value system is. And I think as a journalist, one way to approach that visit is to basically say to people or convey to people a sense that you are genuinely interested in what they do, what their value system is. And not only are you genuinely interested, but you genuinely are going to listen to what they say without imposing your own views at that point. In fact, you shouldn't have views. If you can, you should try and suspend your views while you do honest reporting. And one of the conclusions I've come to in my life as a journalist is that, yes, it's real important to be a good journalist, to be a good writer, or a reasonable writer, or a clear writer. It's really important to be able to master the who, what, when, and where of a story. It's really important to do your research and be reasonably intelligent. But I would argue that the most important quality of a good journalist is to be a good listener. And by that I mean that a good listener is someone who has the humility to assume that he or she doesn't know the answer to the question that they're asking. And they're generally asking that question because they wish to fetch real information. And if you convey that sincerity, that you are honestly listening, people are going to open up. People like to talk. They won't talk if you go into an interview like a dentist and say, here, I'm here to drill your teeth. You have time to do that. Do it on your third or fourth interview. But get that person to open up and talk because you genuinely want them to talk and to tell about themselves. When I was covering the Microsoft trial in 2000, I got the judge in that trial to talk to me on condition that it wouldn't appear until after the trial. And I did 12 hours of interviews with this judge. And the first interview was 4 hours long. And it was basically about his life. I didn't ask a single question in that first interview about the trial. I didn't ask him what he thought of Bill Gates and Microsoft. I asked him, tell me about your parents. Tell me about your life. Tell me about what you did before you became a judge. And he told me that one of the most important experiences of his life was that he worked for the re-election of Richard Nixon in 1972. And he didn't know about Watergate, and he didn't know about the corruption that would unfold there. And he found out about it as a young lawyer. And he was devastated by that. And he felt terribly betrayed that his president, Richard Nixon, was a liar. And it really got to him. And then when I did subsequent interviews with him, adding up to the 12 hours, what I came away with was that first interview colored my opinion of him and how he reached a judgment against Microsoft. Because as he sat in that chair, there was no jury, and he watched Bill Gates' deposition, he was watching Richard Nixon. He was watching someone he thought was not telling the truth. And so his biography became very important to understand the decision that he was making in that trial. So what did I learn on my visit to Planet Google that I might impart here tonight? One of the things I learned is what an engineer does. An engineer begins, and half the employees at Google are engineers. An engineer begins with an attitude. And the attitude is the old ways of doing things are inefficient. And then the engineer asks a single question, which is, why not? Why not have Google News collect all the newspaper and magazine information around the world and make it digitally available to everybody, free of charge. Why not charge advertisers only if someone clicks on an ad, rather than whether they just look at the ad? Why not have free telephones? Why not have free TV, YouTube? Why not have free packaged software, software in a cloud that's stored in a server somewhere, the way your email is stored, and not pay for wrap software in a Microsoft package? So all of these why not questions becomes a very disruptive technology if you're on the other side of that. I learned some other things. I learned that traditional media was very slow to react to this new digital threat. They leaned back. They tended to complain that the digital world was out to kill them, that, oh, woe is me. They didn't invest in digital technology. And if you went to newspapers 10 years ago and you went on their websites, which I did 10 years ago, and you looked at what they were doing, the New York Times website, the Chicago Tribune website, all the LA Times website, yes, they had websites 10 years ago, but those websites were not digitally advanced. What they were was they were run by the editor of the newspaper. You could not post a story online until the next day's newspaper appeared. So the whole purpose of 24/7 news is defeated by that. And the people running it didn't understand that the web is a multimedia platform. It is not just a print platform. And so you think about the mistakes that these traditional media companies made. If they hired engineers, the engineers were down low in the bowels of that organization. They were not reporting to the CEO. The CEO did not understand that that digital engineer was really a content creator. He was, or she was, the person who was going to create those cool apps that you see on the iPad and iPhone today. And think about it. The music companies. The music companies said, no, you have to buy an entire CD. Sorry, $17, $18, $19, you got to buy the whole thing. Well, Apple iTunes comes along in 2001 and say, oh, no. 99 cents, individual records. And by the way, give you 30 seconds to listen to the song to see if you like it before you buy it. Goodbye music companies. Goodbye old model. Think about the advertising companies saying you got to charge 15% for the ads. And by the way, you're buying a Super Bowl ad for $2 million. We can't tell you who's watching that ad. We can't tell you whether they liked your ad. We can't even tell whether they purchased your product. But $2 million because you're getting a huge audience. Well, in the digital world, you can actually tell who's buying your product, and you can actually have a direct relationship with the customer if they buy your product. When I covered Microsoft 10 years ago, one of the things I learned was that you were dealing with people, in this case, at the time, Bill Gates, and I think he's a very different person today than he was then. But Steve Ballmer, who now is the CEO of that company, they were cold businessmen. They loved the idea of defeating Netscape, of defeating Sun, of defeating Apple. They would talk about it with lust, and if you cover that trial as I did, you would read the emails, and that's what the emails were about, killing their opponents. They were cold businessmen. Google is populated not by cold businessmen, but by cold engineers. People who are asking, why not? And thinking we can make this more efficient for the customer. They're not thinking about the impact on the book publishing world, the newspaper world, etc. And let me tell you a story that illustrates that point. My second interview with Google co-founder Sergey Brin, he rollerbladed into a small conference room near his office, threw his knapsack on the table, and he said, Ken, before you start quizzing me, let me ask you a question I've been thinking about. I said, okay. He said, why don't you just publish your book for free on the internet? You'll get a lot more readers. Wouldn't it be fabulous to do that? I said, oh. I said, let me ask you a question. He said, sure, go ahead. I said, who would pay me to come out here? I was living out there and flying out there, renting a car, staying at a hotel, paying for meals for interviews. I said, who would pay me to do that? Oh. I said, who would edit my book? Oh. Who would market my book? Oh. Who would vet my book, legally and otherwise? Oh. And at that point, Sergey Brin wanted to change the subject. Now, what did I learn from that? I learned, A, that he was ignorant about the book publishing business. Genuinely ignorant about it. He was at 30,000 feet looking down, and he didn't understand the details of what went into publishing a book and the economics of making a living, right? And I'm going to give away my book for free, right? What am I working 3 years for? I mean, it really made no sense. And I think he ultimately understood that, which is why he wanted to change the subject. But it also suggested something else, which is Google's then attitude towards copyright. They believe that all information should be free and available to all. They no longer believe that because they've been compelled by government and by traditional media to change that view. I learned something else. We talked about the virtue of an engineer, the tough questions, the why not questions they ask. But I also learned about an engineer's weakness. An engineer is not good at things in general that they can't measure. If you have an algorithm, which Google has with search, they're very good at the mathematical formulas for that. But how do you measure things like fear? Fear of privacy, fear of Google's size, fear of someone, Big Brother, looking over you. They had very little understanding of that because they couldn't measure it. I'll tell you another story. They also had, which relates to this point, they had a weak understanding of the importance of relationships, of making people feel good, of partnering with people, something I know the school talks a lot about. In 2000, when Google was above a bicycle store in Palo Alto, Barry Diller was one of the first traditional media executives to visit Google. And he visited Sergey Brin and Larry Page, and they were sitting there, and Larry Page was sitting there with a PDA in his hand, and he was doing this. And Barry Diller said to him, "Larry, I'm talking to you." He says, "Okay, Barry, I can do both." And Barry Diller, without missing a beat, said, "Larry, choose." And Larry Page, without missing a beat, says, "I choose this." Without looking up, by the way. Barry Diller was looking at the top of this guy's head. Now, if you're in a business where you have YouTube and you want to have professional content on YouTube, you've got to be able to talk to the people in Hollywood. I don't think you would go over very well if you're sitting there with your head down on your PDA. So the importance of relationships was something not easily understood by these people, including the importance of relationships with governments. If you look at Google today, we saw yesterday there was a Senate Judiciary hearing asking whether Google is acting like a monopolist. If you go to the European Union, they're asking questions about Google's impact on privacy. If you go to China or Iran or many other dictatorial countries in the world, they're saying, we don't agree with your notion that information should be free. They don't want their citizens to have free information. They want to control the information. So suddenly Google all around the world is dealing with different value systems than they used to, systems that they don't have a feel for because they can't easily measure it. I learned something else. The way that the digital world has disrupted the economics of the traditional media world. 5, 6, 7 years ago, I used to think the big issue in journalism, a big issue in journalism, was the battle between the newsroom and the business side of newspapers. And I worried that the wall between the two was getting shorter and smaller, and that the business side increasingly was coming to dominate. And there's lots of evidence that this is true. I mean, and it's worsened by the digital world, because in the digital world you can measure what your readers are reading, and one of the things you learn as a publisher is that they're much more interested in Britney Spears and Lindsay Lohan than they are in investigative reporting or reports from state capitals. So that puts a pressure, the business side saying, hey, this is a business, so we want less investigative reporting, less political reporting or on monitoring government, and more lifestyle and other kinds of reporting. But I think what's happened, in my view, has shifted to say the biggest issue now in journalism is economics. And it's a math problem. And the math problem is as follows. If you're in a newspaper business, let's say you're the New York Times, the average reader of the daily New York Times spends roughly 35 minutes a day reading the New York Times. The average reader of the New York Times online spends roughly 35 minutes a month. Think about that difference. Think about if you're an advertiser and you know that that online reader is only spending 35 minutes a month on that paper. You're not going to pay the same amount of money for an ad online as you do in the newspaper. In fact, you pay 10 cents on the dollar. The same ad in an online New York Times, you get, at Times collects 10 cents for what they would collect $1 in the actual newspaper. So the question of economics becomes, I love the idea that if we move to a digital world, I can save money. I don't have paper costs. I don't have distribution costs. I don't have printing paper and printing press costs. So as my circulation is declining, as it is for all newspapers, as my advertising is declining, as it is for all newspapers, the question is, can I make up, can my income from the digital world rise enough to make up for that, even though I'm saving some of the money from printing and printing fewer newspapers? And the answer so far is no. And that's the math problem that newspapers have. Think about the math problem that book publishers have. As we move to a digital world where a book is much cheaper you buy a book for basically $14.95 that you pay, digital book, an e-book, $14.95. Same book you pay $30 for a print book. Now that's, as publishers don't have to spend money for books to print those books, very expensive to print them, distribute them, warehouse them. And it's also one of the great hidden costs of publishing, book publishing, is that 50% of the books are returned from bookstores. And you have to pay for that as a book publisher. That's the deal you have to keep bookstores in business. But one of the other problems you have is the bookstores are not staying in business. And that really hurts the publishing business, because a big part of sales for books is a serendipitous purchase. You walk into a store and you buy a book you didn't expect you would buy. But today, you know how many independent bookstores are left in America? 1,400. Just 1,400. I'm not talking about Barnes & Noble. I'm talking about independent bookstores. So increasingly, you're in a world where the digital, you have to print the books, you still have the return, you still have those bookstores. At the same time, you're putting these e-books out, which you're selling at a much cheaper rate, but maybe you're saving money. But then on the other hand, you know that Apple and Amazon and Barnes & Noble, they're going to keep lowering the price on you. You got away with it, $14.95, you're forcing them to pay that now. Will you be able to 2 years from now? If you're in the book publishing business, you're really worried what happens to your business. And yet, having said that, I would suggest to you that there are reasons for optimism. That in fact, the digital world and the analog or traditional media world are coming closer together. And let me give some illustrations of what I mean. Google bought YouTube for $1.6 billion several years ago. And YouTube, for a number of years, lost a lot of money. In fact, in 2009, YouTube was expected to lose $500 million. And suddenly the engineers at Google, after several years, realized, oh my God, we don't have this right. We really got to think the way an advertiser would think. Why can't we get any advertising on YouTube? I'll tell you why. Because YouTube is user-generated content. Does an advertiser want their friendly ad to appear in an unpredictable spot next to some dog pooping? No brainer, right? So Google says, hey, wait a second, we need more professional content in order to get advertising. And by the way, we need more professional content in order to begin to charge for it. So if you go to Google today, you can buy movies on Google. You see professional ads on Google, on YouTube. YouTube is making money, a profit. And in fact, Google has figured out, my God, we can compete with Netflix, which is exactly what they're going to be doing. And by the way, also Apple is doing that, as is Amazon. But where do they get the content? They got to go to traditional media companies, Hollywood studios and the networks and cable companies to buy that content, just as Netflix does. Or think about iTunes. Apple has 200 million credit cards. And look at the apps that you pay for. Ringtone, your ring phones on your phone, you pay for. The games, Zynga, etc., you pay for. I mean, music, you pay for. What started out where people thought the internet should be free, and you shouldn't pay for anything, which is something that terrorized newspapers and magazines and a lot of traditional media companies. Increasingly, those companies are opening up a revenue source from digital companies like Netflix and Apple and YouTube. And that actually is a source of some encouragement that these two sides are coming closer together. A generation is being taught potentially that information is not free. That if you want to read a book, you want to read a newspaper, you want to read a magazine, you want to watch a TV show or a movie, you should pay for it. Because if you don't pay for it, there are not going to be any more Martin Scorsese's making movies if you can't make a living doing it. So, at the same time, traditional media, I think, has also learned that you need relationships. They need the Hollywood relationships. They need the newspaper relationships. And one of the most significant things that happened in Google's development, which is also significant in terms of the world of publishing, when Google settled, it's still not agreed to by a federal judge, and it may not be agreed to, but Google agreed 3 years ago to pay $125 million to authors and publishers, saying that we believe that you have a right to copyright and we should pay for it. That is a very significant statement by the major digital company in this world that information is not necessarily free. Hopefully, traditional media has learned some things as well. And if you look at the iPad today and you see some of the apps that are on there, those traditional media companies have learned that, in fact, I am not just putting my New York Times or my Los Angeles Times on an iPad and you watch the print version. I'm going to another platform that is offering my viewers or readers a multimedia experience. So, for instance, one of the most significant things that illustrate this, when Art Buchwald, the columnist, died several years ago, if you went to the NewYorkTimes.com, you saw next to the obit, you could, with your finger, press and get Art Buchwald live talking to you and saying, "Hi, I'm Art Buchwald, and I died today. And let me tell you about my life." Think about it. It gives you chills when you think about it. That is something you can't do in a newspaper. You would pay to see stuff like that. But that's a realization that the New York Times and a lot of traditional media has come to, that in fact this is a new medium. This is a medium that can enrich our newspaper. So if I am a newspaper and I have an online application, I can offer you my archive. If you want to read about Ted Kennedy the day he died, you can press with your finger and watch Ted Kennedy being interviewed on Charlie Rose or NPR or whatever. It just opens up a whole new world and enriches the journalism in quite a profound, I think, way. So I think one of the things that traditional media have to learn, and they're beginning to learn to do, is to throw more things against the wall and see what sticks. So the New York Times, for instance, has instituted this past winter a paywall, which they say if you want to read the New York Times online, if you subscribe to the New York Times, you can do it online for free. If you don't subscribe to the New York Times, you have to subscribe online, and you could do that. Now, we're going to whet your appetite a little bit. We're going to give you 20 free trips to New York Times stories a month, where you can without paying, you can read 20 stories. But the 21st story, you have to start subscribing. So far, this has been a success. They've had only 2 quarters of it. But already they have 250,000 people, as of the second quarter, who were paid subscribers to the online New York Times. 750,000 subscribers to the newspaper had signed up for free, but nevertheless they had to sign up to get the online newspaper. That's a very encouraging sign that, in fact, maybe the world and the culture is changing and that people will be more willing to pay for information. I'll tell you something else we've learned, all of us, I think. And that's the speed of change is happening so rapidly that it's changing all of our worlds and making all of us insecure. Let me give you an illustration. It took the telephone 7 decades to reach 50% of the American public. It took electricity 5 decades to reach 50% of the American public. It took television 3 decades to reach 50% of the American public. It took the internet 9 years. It took Facebook 5 years to reach 750 million users. That speed of change is really important, because we were talking in the seminar before we came here this evening about whether government should intervene and create rules and regulations for digital businesses. And that question was being asked during the Microsoft trial in 2000. And in fact, there was an argument. You don't have to intervene. Government's involved in privacy questions, antitrust questions with digital companies or non-digital companies already. But do you police the internet world? Or in fact, because of the speed of change, because of that unknown person in the garage, are things happening so fast that it's going to police itself? That innovation is going to disrupt the Microsofts or the Googles? My bet is that it will. That there is, as Bill Gates feared, some guy in a garage coming up with something that Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook has never thought about and scares the shit out of him. And that's a healthy thing. I learned finally one other thing to share with you. And that is, and I'm simplifying this, there are 2 types of people in this world. There are people who lean back. Oh, woe is me. Oh, what terrible things happening. Oh, Google is doing this awful thing to me. Oh, Microsoft's doing this awful thing to me. People who tend to lean back that way also tend to be pessimists. They tend to be people who see the glass as half empty. The other type of person I would call those who lean forward. The person who leans forward is someone who wakes up with a sense of optimism, doesn't blame other people for their woes, tends to see a problem as an opportunity, not as something that's defeating them. And what kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be a person who wakes up in the morning with a sense of gloom, gets an ulcer at an early age? You don't want to do that. So I leave you with a final thought to capsize or make that point. There was a great writer by the name of Albert Camus who fought in the French Resistance. He was actually a man who had real bouts of depression after the war, but was a great writer. And he had lots of reasons to be depressed, to not want to get out of bed. But he once wrote something that has always stayed with me, and I share with you as I end my talk. Albert Camus said, "A good hope is better than a bad holding." Thank you.
I want to thank Ken for that very enlightening, very broadly based, at the same time profound introduction into the world of Google and the kinds of changes it's bringing to the world that we thought we knew. And we'll have some Q&A, but I thought I'd just sort of start by asking a couple of questions. One is, I think I'd like to visit planet Auletta. And we have a lot of students in the audience, of course, and I suspect that they would be very interested in having you say something about the following, which is, you've been really the premier business writer and economic writer for the past couple of decades, at a time when that was not the most popular field for journalists to go into. And I wonder if you could say something about what was it, Ken, that was it your personality, was it your upbringing, was it early exposure to these issues that made you say, my passion is to look at industry and economics and the media business?
You know, I have a graduate degree in political science. I thought I would be, when I got out of graduate school, I was in a PhD program, and I got the master's, and then I was bored with it, but I thought my life would be in government. And then I covered government as a journalist. I worked in government for a period of time when I was young. In fact, I worked in politics when this guy in the front row, Richard Reeves, who probably misteaches many of you here, was the chief political correspondent for the New York Times, which when I met Dick in the late 60s. And, but I thought I would be in government, and then I thought I would cover government and politics, which I did. And then I wrote a book on poverty, and I thought I would follow that. And then I wrote a book on business, and I wrote a book on Wall Street. And then I wound up in the media. So you go figure. I don't have a formula for that. But I think life, I mean, all of you at the beginning of your careers think you're going to be doing something you probably won't be doing 10 years or 20 years from now. That's terrific. The way I look at it, I visited lots of planets, and I love that. But I've now spent more time. Well, no, actually, I spend as much more time in politics and government, covering it and participating in it, than I have in media. But I spend a long time now covering the media, and I don't feel exhausted by it, because I think it's that speed of change I was talking about makes it so enticing and for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me maybe ask you to be a little prescriptive and say, with all of these changes, with the pace of change moving so quickly, what advice would you give to young scholars and young journalists and people who want to go into the communications business? Are there special aptitudes or skills that they should begin to seize upon to be able to deal with this change more effectively?
Well, I think you can't think of yourself as a unidimensional journalist, for instance, if journalism is your field. You've got to think of yourself not just as a print journalist or a TV journalist, but as someone who does it all. You can blog, and you could carry a video pack and know how to use an uplink and file your newspaper stories online and do audio. You're basically going to be out there alone, and the costs have to come down in the news world. The New York Times today has a little over 1,000 journalists. They won't have 1,000 journalists 4 years from now. It'll go down. But yet they're getting into video and audio and doing much more in the web. Think about Patch, which is owned by AOL. They're hiring more journalists than any other institution in America. And there are about 1,000 Patch sites around the country, each with a single journalist who's paid $40,000 to $50,000, lives in that community of no more than 75,000 people, and they are covering that. They're responsible to cover that local, hyper-local site, and they got to file stuff. They got to do stuff online. They're working with engineers. They got to do video. They got to do all of that. So I think you have to do all of that. But I would go back to what I said in my remarks. You can master those skills, which you have to. But the most important skill, if we're talking about journalism here, I would argue, is the humility to be a good listener. Because otherwise you're not going to hear what the person is saying. You're not going to get people to open up to you. You're not going to report for people what the truth is, because you've honestly tried to hear from all sides.
I'd like to think that here at the Annenberg School, that's something that we try to teach, so that when our students work on teams with engineers, when the engineers are going this way and doing the excellent work they do here, our students are able to think 360 degrees and understand context, etc. But let me ask you another question about being a good journalist, especially for when you do this kind of writing. You've had unparalleled access to really titans of industry. And it seems to me that perhaps presents sometimes a bit of a challenge to a journalist. On the one hand, you have to develop a sense of trust. They have to trust you based on the way you present yourself, but also your earlier writing. And at the same time, you've got to say some pretty tough stuff to the people who have developed a sense of trust in you. And I wonder if, looking back on your career, if you felt at some time, maybe early on, you didn't quite get the balance right, that maybe you were too nice with your sources or you were too tough on the sources. But how do you handle that? How do you do that?
Well, you know, I as I said, I worked in government and politics in my 20s, and when I left politics, involuntarily, by the way, my candidate for office was defeated with my help, and I went to work for the Village Voice, and one of the first pieces I wrote for the Village Voice was the differences, the similarities and differences between journalists and politicians. And one of the points I made then, which I would make again today, is that in some ways journalists are more ruthless than politicians. Because politicians have a loyalty system. People, you help me, I'm loyal to you, build relationships and stuff like that. Journalists are not supposed to have that loyalty system except to what they see as the truth. So one of the things that I try and do, and hopefully you do it every time, there's always a danger. When you, I, for instance, to give you one concrete example, I spent 5 months with Rupert Murdoch in '95 doing a New Yorker profile of him. And it was 20,000 words long, and he opened up more than he ever had before. And I lived in his office for 10 days and did, you know, morning, noon, and night. We had dinner 8 of the 10 nights, and really spent a lot of time. He could be a very charming guy, and enjoyable. He's not an introspective person. If you ask him to dig inside himself, he can't do that. He's never thought, you know, been reflective that way. But he was an interesting man. I enjoyed his company. But then, when you get away, you've done all the reporting, you do all the people, you go back to your desktop and you sort through the material. The key is you're not writing, your audience is not Rupert Murdoch. Your audience is the reader. And you don't know who that reader is, but you feel, or hopefully you feel, an obligation to that reader to get it right, and you're not seduced by, yeah, I enjoyed Murdoch, or that was a funny story he told, and I'm really appreciative he opened up his office to me. The ruthless part of you comes in, and you write what you think is the truth. I wrote a piece, 20,000 words long, called The Pirate. Murdoch has not talked to me since. And truth is, I don't care. And is that ruthless? Maybe. On the other hand, if you say, I have an obligation to the reader, you don't feel ruthless at all. You feel like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. But have you hurt someone? Yeah. But that happens. Now, are there times where you spend time when people open up to you that maybe you're more sympathetic? Sure, that's always a danger that you, but the advantage you have at a place like the New Yorker with the book is the luxury of time gives you more ability to step back and get a distance and fact check and hopefully get that right balance.
Good. Let me ask one more question, and I'll also say in advance for those of you who are watching from our distributed sites in room 207 and in the lobby, if you want to start making your way down, if you have a question for our guest, if you want to start making your way down to the auditorium, then I welcome you to do so. But I want to ask one more question. Since we're on a college campus, and you also referred to this, and this is the Google Books issue. And the two founders said, we want to organize all knowledge, and it'll be a great thing. And clearly it would have some benefits, but there's been a big dispute, as I think our audience probably knows, about the ability of Google to essentially copy vast numbers of books. And there's been a big dispute over how they should pay copyright to the original owners or the authors. So let me just read briefly, and you alluded to this earlier. You said there are two potential momentous shifts here. This is when the judgment was levied. First, Google had conceded it must pay for some content. And second, Google was not relying on a promise of advertising revenues to reach an agreement. Rather, it agreed to put up upfront compensation, an upfront compensation formula of a sort it had refused to make with other traditional media companies. And so I wonder if you could sort of help us a little bit, because it's a really complicated issue, of your view on how we should judge the utility of Google making these tremendous investments in knowledge, but at the same time perhaps denying to those authors payment that they might otherwise get, or perhaps biasing in some ways the store of knowledge by copying these books and not other books. So I think for this audience that might be a helpful thing
Well,
to do.
think about this. What if Google in '98, when it started, instead of saying we're going to create a search engine, we're going to create an engine that you could watch any movie ever made on your computer. Do you think they could have gotten away with that? No way. Hollywood studios would have killed them. They'd be out of business. They never would have gotten first base. Google began with an idea, with two ideas really. A belief that all information should be free. They really believe that. And they believe in something in the law, it's called fair use. Which is fair use means that you're allowed to you can quote from a book or from a song, but you can't take too much of it. And what is too much is often defined by the courts. Google's attitude was fair use meant the whole book, a whole music, and again, to go back to the engineer, they were asking why not. They started with an attitude that the old ways of doing things are wrong. And they thought about from the customer's point of view. The customer's point of view is, my God, Google's right. Wouldn't it be great if I could get any book I wanted for free and listen to any music or watch or any newspaper or magazine? Wouldn't that be cool? Great. But then you get the pushback, which they would have gotten if they had gone in the movie business right away. But then the book publishers and the Authors Guild push back on books. As TV studios and movies push back on YouTube. As AP push back on taking newspapers. And suddenly Google, these innocent guys, and again, these are just cold engineers, again. Suddenly these cold engineers, these innocent guys are saying, oh my God, we can't do this because they're not going to let us. And suddenly governments are pushing in on them. And they're saying, oh my God, we've got to stop paying for lobbyists and make campaign contributions. This is the real world. Welcome, kids. You're grown-ups now. And so in the real world, the publishers push back and Google is forced to get educated and say, well, we can't do that. we can't just take books digitally. And in fact, if you think about it, look at what Google Books is doing now. Google Books has come along and they say, not only will we let the publishers, in any book, you can charge on Google Books, and you pay us what you're paying Apple or what you're paying Kindle, which is 30% of each. But in addition to that, what Google Books has done, they said, we're going to go to bookstores, which really can't compete in the digital world. I mean, they only sell hard copies. They say, the bookstore has a website. We will let people go to their website to buy books from bookstores. So Google's not trying to monopolize it. That's an example of getting an education about the real world. That is one of the hopeful things that is taking place right now. And I think when the magazines and newspapers said to Steve Jobs, you can't just take and say, don't give us any access to our customers and the information about our customers, that you own the subscriber, we don't have any say. They fought back on that, as they fought back on Amazon, which wanted to set prices on books. And I think that two-way dialogue and battle is actually producing some more consensus than we would have expected.
Interesting. Okay, let's open it up and have an interactive two-way dialogue here with the group formerly known as the audience. There's a microphone here, there's a microphone here, and I would simply ask, the ground rules are that you give us your name and your affiliation. So if you're at Annenberg or the college or whatever, or with Google, then you just let us know. Yes, ma'am. No, you're a help. All right, good. Yes, sir.
Right here?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Will Riley. I am a freshman at USC. And my question, I want to propose a little bit of a hypothetical. Maybe it's not so hypothetical. We don't know. Maybe you know because you have more information. But we've been talking about titans of information, not only information providing, but also, in my opinion, information gathering. Facebook has all kinds of information on us, Google as well. It is fathomable, in my mind, that the U.S. government or any government would one day have a strong belief that maybe Google or Facebook or a company like that had some information on an individual where if they knew that information, they could prevent possibly the deaths or harm to hundreds of thousands of people. Would it be ethical for the government to ask Google to provide that information if they had it, or Facebook or something like that?
I think they already do. Under the Patriot Act, which allows the government, federal government, to go to phone companies or search companies or other digital companies like Facebook and say, we need to know more about this person because we suspect they're a terrorist. We're allied with terrorists. So we don't know how many subpoenas under the Patriot Act Google or Facebook have complied with, but we know they have. And so this is going on now. It doesn't get a lot of attention, and those companies, neither the government nor those companies have an interest in giving it much attention. But just as phone companies for years have complied with subpoenas to turn over phone records, that's happening in the digital world too. Then the question is that kind of privacy can it be invaded in other ways? And governments around the world here, Europe is much more advanced on the privacy question than we are, much more concerned about it, are beginning to impose standards. Because one of the dirty little secrets is that all of these digital companies want to gather as much private information about you as they can in order to sell it to advertisers. And an advertiser has a real interest in knowing as much about you. For instance, if I'm Mercedes, right, or a car company, instead of me paying $2 million for a Super Bowl ad, what if I could just pay to target all luxury car owners on Facebook or Google search? If I had that information, what would I pay for that as a luxury car company? It'd It's a rifle shot, not a shotgun blast. And so it's a very efficient form of advertising. And they all know that, and the advertisers know that, and the advertisers are panting to get that information from phone companies and Google and everyone else. The question is, at some point, will the government do? Will we as citizens raise objections? And we've seen when Facebook, we thought Facebook went too far, the public and their users begin to rebel. But what will government do? And will government protect us? And that's a real role for government.
Let's
Thank
go
you.
to this side. Yep.
Hi, my name's Willie Nolan. I'm a first-year grad student here at Annenberg. And I have a question. You talked a little bit about like Sergey Brin and Larry Page and even Mark Zuckerberg. And I'm curious, because those are all three individuals who have plenty of money to retire and live in houses made out of gold. But I'm curious because they continue to introduce products like Google just introduced a car that basically drives itself. And these are products and projects whose profit seems to be far, far away, if in existence at all. And I'm wondering if you see these guys, you brought up the difference between Microsoft being run by cold businessmen and Google being run by cold engineers. Are these people who you see get a lot of like satisfaction out of what they're doing or are interested in what they're doing because of the way they can like change the world, or are they in it in to make as much money as possible, like people accuse Bill Gates of doing?
I think, as I suggested in my remarks, I think Gates is a different person today than he was 10 years ago, if you look at his philanthropic efforts. And I think a lot of that was brought about by his wife and the humanizing effect that she had on him. But he's not the, I mean, I think he'd probably offer me a Diet Coke today. Though actually, I should admit, he's another person who doesn't talk to me, so he didn't like my book. But
You better stop writing these books, man.
but the truth is that if Mark Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin and Larry Page and a lot of people in the Valley are pretty idealistic. Now, they might not fit your definition of idealism, and you may feel their idea, what they want to do, for instance, make all information available to everybody, is an idealistic notion that conflicts with my notion of copyright or your notion with how to make a living. But there's an innocence to it and a kind of a sweetness to it. It's not about making a lot of money. These are not materialistic guys. Do Sergey Brin and Larry Page each have big jet airplanes? And Larry Page have a helicopter and their boats and all? Yes, but these are not. They're not like some of these moguls who are really about keeping score by how much money they make, and that's one of their attractions. And Zuckerberg, he still wears his hoodie, and there is an element of idealism that you see in a fair number of people out there where they honestly think they're changing the world for the good. And it may not always be true that they are, but they think they are.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Lily Lu. I'm from Communication Management Program. I watch a lot about Facebook's media business, especially today. They just announced that they will enable the user to rent movies, to watch movies, or listen to music together. So I was wondering, like in 5 years or in 3 years, Facebook will be a very strong force in the media business, because right now these things are compete with Apple, they compete with Google for the media consumption. We consider there will be a very strong force in the near future. Thank you.
I think that all of these companies, Facebook is moving towards figuring out other revenue streams they can tap into. Movies, you betcha. And by the way, that's what Apple's doing, that's what Amazon's doing, that's what YouTube is doing. They're going right after, they see Netflix has a pretty good business, so they're going after that. And as that happens, as Facebook gets into the movie business or television business on their platform, thinking of Facebook as a platform to put apps on, and apps are TV shows or whatever, What that does for traditional media companies is, oh my God, this is another platform for me. And that's the change. What's happened, it used to be if you were in the television business, and you did, if you're Norman Lear, the great Norman Lear, who's deigned to be with us tonight, I'm happy to say, who produced some of the greatest shows in television history, his shows would sell in what was called syndication to all local TV stations. Well, increasingly, the equivalent of those TV stations, they don't, not as much money involved in it, are other platforms. Netflix is a platform, YouTube is a platform, Facebook is going to become a platform, Amazon and Apple are platforms, Hulu's a platform. And all of them are competing, and as they do, the traditional media, the television studios and the Hollywood studios are saying, this is great, you know, I mean, it's another source of revenue for us, because we know the DVD business, which has been a gold mine for us, is drying up. We know the TV syndication business is drying up. Maybe this will provide another revenue stream. At the same time, those digital companies like Facebook are saying, how do I create another revenue stream besides just advertising? Facebook just makes its money from advertising now. But if they can sell movies, pay-per-view, that's, you know, and they're all trying to do the same thing.
Hi, my name is Ahmed Darwish. I'm an alum. I actually studied engineering here at USC. But I appreciate your comments. They're absolutely right on. I work at DirecTV.
Would you give me a Diet Coke?
I would totally give you that. I studied industrial engineering, though, so we're slightly different. I work at DirecTV, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the rising costs of programming. So, for example, ESPN recently bought the rights to NFL Monday Night Football for X number of years for an exorbitant amount of money, and they have to make that money back somehow. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the impact of the rising programming costs that the industry as a whole is facing.
I think you can actually make an argument that some programming costs are going down and will go down, certainly the movie business. They're not paying the kind of, in most cases, the kind of money and the kind of package deals that they once made, in part because it just becomes exorbitant. And I think, you know, everyone is AMC is a good example of this. AMC, American Movie Classics, they would repeat movies, and suddenly they realized, my God, maybe we have two sources of revenue. We have advertising and we have subscription. We have to start creating programming. So they created Mad Men. And they now have several shows that have been not as successful as Mad Men, but pretty successful. But it gets pretty expensive, and they had a really tough negotiations with Mad Men, with Matt Weiner, who's the creator of Mad Men, and they finally reached an agreement. But increasingly, as you get many more choices, the size of your audience will decline. As the size of your audience declines, your ability to pay more and more money will also decline. And if that happens, then the economics argue that, you know, they'll be paying less for programming. And so that's one of the, but ESPN is an anomaly. ESPN has such dominance, they can afford to pay that, and they have another platform, which is ABC, and they could share that, and they basically just turn to, they are so popular, ESPN, that they can turn to the cable companies and say, you have to pay X amount of dollars per subscriber for us, or you won't get ESPN. And the cable companies have caved to that because ESPN is so valuable. But most other programming entities don't have the kind of leverage over cable companies that ESPN has.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Leonard Hyman. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student, so completely unrelated to everything. But I was curious about the way you sort of made this dichotomy between kind of people supporting free media versus traditional media companies. I kind of see it kind of creating this third space now where you have like more sort of distributed sources of funding, like, you know, individuals buying apps, or, you know, individuals getting advertisement, as opposed to coming from this kind of centralized source. And sort of the clearinghouse model that the, you know, music companies and movie companies have had for so long doesn't seem to work as well in in that environment. And kind of along the same lines, it seems like there's a lot more money for developing new platforms like Facebook and Google and so forth, but less money for content like the New York Times and publishing houses and movie studios. I'm wondering what you make of sort of the developing model that's coming out of that.
Let me just interrupt for a second. I think what I'd like to do is take a couple of questions all in a row and then ask you to answer those so we make sure that everybody has...
If you can remember what the questions were.
Well, they can repeat. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
That was a tough question, though. That was a long and tough question. Yes.
My name is Cabell Smith, and I've worked for many years in the news business and the entertainment business, and I'm just a fan of your book. But I was wondering what you thought of the proposed Comcast NBC Universal merger and the conglomerization of production and distribution.
Let me take one question here behind you, and then we'll ask our guest to answer those three questions.
My name is Julie Nyberg, and I work in the Rossier School of Education. And my question is related to the classroom and the speed in which you see the classroom landscape changing, related to economics, in that the students who leave our classrooms are now facing new jobs of the 21st century, and related to media in relationship to digital media literacy and becoming critical consumers of media, but also participating in this culture where they're generating media. What change do you think needs to occur in the classroom landscape in order to best facilitate that development for future leaders?
There are new models for revenue. Obviously, it's not, it just to take the traditional media, the movie business. I mean, you suddenly have wealthy people paying, funding for movies, and obviously you have ways. Zynga, is a very successful game company using the Facebook platform that generates money off of that, the way many apps do. I mean. Apple has made a lot of millionaires out of or people who are comfortable just creating apps, very small. But I think that if you want to, you can't pay for a quality program like Mad Men with that generally that kind of income. You need a base, a bigger base. In Mad Men's case, AMC is owned by Cablevision. But yeah, I think there are other models, and that's exciting. I mean, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Comcast and NBC are already, and Universal are already merged. That merger has been approved by the government. My attitude on that is that I don't see that as a monopoly, frankly. I mean, you have so many different sources of television out there. The worry is, and the government imposed this on Comcast, the worry is that they would not take competitors and give them a bad channel position. Bloomberg made that argument. They gave them a better channel position. When Time Warner and Turner Broadcasting merged, the government insisted that CNN, which was owned by Turner, not get most favored nation treatment, discriminating against Fox or MSNBC or anyone else. And I think that's a proper role for government to assure that happens. But Universal is not a monopoly movie studio. NBC is certainly not. Every year they lose audience. All the networks lose audience every year. And so the notion that you're dealing with a monopoly, I think, is kind of an antiquated notion today for that. The education question, I wish I had a simple way and the wisdom to impart on that. I don't have a really good answer. I don't know of any teacher that doesn't worry about the impact of technology on his or her ability to teach, or should we allow the student to come into the classroom with a digital device? Are they paying attention to us or using it as an enabler to take notes for the class, or maybe to do a search for something and it comes up in a lecture, or to record what you're saying in that lecture? But one of the worries, I am more an optimist than a pessimist about digital, and I tend to see the opportunities, not the pitfalls. But one of the pitfalls is, what does the digital world do to our brains? And there's a fair amount of research that's been done that people who do all of their learning and reading in the digital world are surfing too much and flitting too much and not concentrating. I have a nephew who said to me a year ago, he was telling me about the A he had gotten on a history paper. And I said, so how did you do research for that paper? And he said, Wikipedia. You know, I was able to look up stuff in Google search. I was able to do it. Now, he didn't plagiarize, because schools have an ability now to have sites that you can literally check whether it's plagiarized, and he passed that fine. But did he dig into books the way he might have to do a history paper when you didn't have Wikipedia and the digital and the Google search? And that's the worry, that you will do, your knowledge will become more superficial, and your understanding will become more superficial. And therefore, it's working against you in the classroom. And that's a worrisome. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but that's what I think about.
Let's have one more round. We'll do 2 here and 1 here, and then we'll ask Mr. Auletta to answer.
Hi, I'm David, and I study journalism here in Annenberg. I was just wondering, now as a 13 or almost 14-year company, Google has certainly gone through a lot of innovation, especially in the beginning. But now, as they sort of have become more successful, they bought YouTube and then attempted to buy Groupon, failed, made Google offers, and then now have made Google+, which is pretty much just a combination of Facebook and Twitter. So do you see Google as sort of losing their innovative edge? And in that same vein, have we sort of now, with all these companies, are we now settling into a more stable environment where there are more, we sort of have the big companies we have Facebook, we have Apple, we have Google, who are buying up some of the smaller companies, or do you think the future will still be driven by the people in their garages making their own innovations?
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sarah Myers. I'm a grad student here at Annenberg. You've mentioned a couple of times the challenges that Google has faced in working abroad in particular, and I know that Facebook also recently hired a team of former diplomats to work for them. So my question is, how do you see sort of the evolution of their operations abroad and how they encounter different challenges of different views of what news media should be or information should be?
Yes, sir.
Hi. My name is Tim McHugh. I'm an alumni. And I was curious, when you're talking about the shifting roles that we're seeing, which had been performed by studios and networks, certainly in the day when All in the Family was on CBS had to get a license from the FCC, and as part of that, they had to work in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. As this is shifting over now to the internet, if Facebook starts broadcasting shows, I mean, the Wi-Fi signal, I guess, is going to go through those same airwaves. Will there be any kind of public interest, convenience, and necessity requirements, do you think, for this new form of broadcasting?
Again, government is the agent of pound gorilla here. They decide the rules, but obviously the spectrum is owned by the government. So if they're going to be using that platform, they have to have some kind of relationship with someone who owns spectrum to get that out to the public, be it the telephone company or cable or some kind of Wi-Fi, wireless. But they've got to somehow make some kind of a deal. That spectrum is regulated by the government, so the government could decide, as they do with broadcasting, to regulate it. I think it's fraught with danger when you do that, particularly First Amendment dangers. We don't regulate newspapers, but we regulate broadcast television. And traditionally, broadcasters have complained that's not fair. But we say, we're giving you that free spectrum, which broadcasters get, and therefore we can require you to do certain things, like have news, have public interest programming, etc. Now, do you extend that? You don't do that to cable, or cable, to avoid that, created C-SPAN as for free to give people information. Is there equivalent that the digital world will do to say it? Do they have to do it if they're just doing movies and TV shows? You know, and and if you do it, how do you do it? I mean, how do you regulate that? It's really fraught with complications, obviously, all of it. But these are all future questions that we can't know the answer to right now. And in part, it may depend on whether something terrible happens. That people, there's a clamor for, we have to regulate this. And where someone charges too much, or we're gouged in some way, or someone abuses that power. That will help determine the answer to that question. The question of I believe that we are not looking at a static world where Facebook and Google are it's a given that they will be dominant 10 years from now. I go back to the garage. There's someone working on something in that garage that is going to upset these people. Google is no longer a small company, and one of the challenges that any business has is how do you get big and yet act small? Google has always acted small, even though it got big. It's gone from 25,000 employees now, and when the Motorola deal goes through, which they just acquired Motorola, it will become 50,000 employees. Will they become bureaucratic? And that's one of the basic questions to that. And the third question, senior moment, what was it again?
Third question.
How do you see sort of these companies operating abroad?
Internationally.
Well, actually, one of the interesting things to watch is Facebook in China. Facebook has 750 million users, but they're not in China, the world's largest population. Everyone wants to be in China. Google tried to be in China and finally said, we can't put up with this censorship. And by the way, this is part of the idealism here. Google did something that Microsoft didn't do, Yahoo didn't do, and other companies didn't do. They exited China. They said, we are not going to operate under this form of censorship. And so they gave up an opportunity in the world's largest market. That's a big deal. And they deserve credit, in my judgment, for that. Facebook wants desperately, as everyone does, to get into China. Mark Zuckerberg is studying Mandarin. He's engaged to, his fiancée is Chinese. He has visited China twice in the last 2 years. He really would like to get in there. When you talk to them, I did a piece on Facebook that ran in June or July, and Sheryl Sandberg, who's the COO there. And one of the things that Zuckerberg and she and others said to me, he said, is it our job to censor what people want? Don't we have to comply with local laws? That becomes an excuse to allow the Chinese government to do what they want. What do they want? They don't want information to be free, and they want to monitor who's talking about them and about other things. Will Facebook comply with that? Big question. And it's worth watching. And if they do, what will it do to their business? How will people feel differently about Facebook if they're willing to make that kind of a compromise? Big question. And we know that Yahoo turned over some dissident names of people who turned out to be dissidents who are now in jail in China. And that's pretty amazing and pretty outrageous in my judgment. And so these are all questions. I mean, are you a business person, or what happened to your social motivation in that? Well, you are a business person, and you want to make a business, and you have shareholders at some point that become a public company. On the other hand, is there a point at which you say, I won't cross this line? It's unethical. I'll end with this thought. Of all the things I've done in journalism, I never had more fun than when in 1993, for The New Yorker, I went around, I interviewed about 25 media leaders. People like Murdoch, people like Iger, not Iger, but Michael Eisner, who was the head of Disney at the time, Jack Welch, who was the head of General Electric, who owned NBC,
Sumner.
No, not Stone. The producer, the director. No, not Stone.
Oh, Oliver
Stone. Oliver Stone. David Geffen. Just a whole group of the Michael Ovitz. A whole group of these mogul type people. And I said, I want to come and talk to you. I'll have only one question, but I'm not going to tell you what the question is. Okay. So I go and I ask each of them with my recorder on, what wouldn't you do? As the head of Fox, as the head of Disney, as Oliver Stone director, what wouldn't you do? And I'd done some research on each of them, what they had done, some of the things they had done that were questionable, right? And one of the things that was really, one of the reasons I love this, they were all, with two exceptions, they were really uncomfortable with the question. And they were uncomfortable because they had never thought about what they wouldn't do. They had only thought about what they would do. These are the same people, like Murdoch, like Eisner, who went home at night and policed what their children watched on television. But by day, they went to the office and they made programs that they wouldn't let their own kids see. And I found that totally enthralling. And what I really found enthralling was that they were not introspective enough to make a connection that they were split personalities. And one of the people who was not a split personality, was very intriguing, was David Geffen, who had made billions of dollars in the music business. And he just said flat out, I wouldn't put on some of that rap music. I wouldn't put on some of that misogynist music. I just wouldn't do it. And he thought about it. That surprised me. But what delighted me was the discomfort of the...
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Ken Auletta and let's welcome him back to Annenberg Planet next time. Thanks, Ken. Really good. Thank you.